Welcome. This is session 11. Today we'll be talking about the rise of Rome. Our story will focus on the developments as Roman leaders began to impact the story and as they come to Jerusalem. And this storyline will lead right into the stories of the birth of Jesus and the New Testament. Of the many parables that Jesus told, one of the very brief parables seemed to clearly make reference to one of the individuals that will be in our story today. So I'm going to share with you the parable, and then as we tell our story, perhaps you will be able to see to whom Jesus apparently is making reference. Jesus says, "A man of noble birth went to a distant country to have himself appointed king and then to return. So he called 10 of his servants and gave them 10 minas, it's a hefty sum of money. 'Put this money to work,' he said, 'until I come back.' But his subjects hated him and sent a delegation after him to say, 'We don't want this man to be our king.' He was made king, however, and returned home. Two brothers, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus, were vying somewhat for their place in the succession of King of the Jews and High Priest. Hyrcanus II was the older of the two brothers, was the legitimate ruler, and Aristobulus, his younger brother, was a very good leader with great leadership qualities. Hyrcanus II, however, did not have the kind of leadership capability that his younger brother did, and off in the wings was a young, shrewd politician, Antipater, who pretty much sized up the situation and realized that this could possibly be a place where he could find his way into the political story and where he might be able to create a political future for himself. So Antipater sides with Hyrcanus and throws his support to Hyrcanus II, and in good measure as a result of that, Hyrcanus II is able to function in his role as King of the Jews and High Priest. In 63 BC, the pagan Roman general Pompeii shows up in Jerusalem. Pompeii comes to the temple area and walks across the outer courts of the temple, makes his way right to the temple itself. He enters into the temple building and goes right into the very heart, the very throne room, the very place of worship and greatest intimacy between God and man, the Holy of Holies. He does so with no respect, total disregard of what this place signifies for the Jews. And he stands there in the very room that is the most sacred place in all of the world for the Jews. Even the high priest of the Jews, as you know, could only go into that particular room once a year to offer a sin sacrifice or offering for the people. In his brashness and his boldness, Pompey declares later that he went into this room and he didn't see God. Although he did not take any of the temple furnishings, you could only imagine perhaps the horror that it struck in the hearts of the Jews. Unimaginable and so highly sacrilegious that this pagan ruler would enter into their most sacred space. Undoubtedly, they felt as if the judgment of God was going to be unleashed on them. When Pompey completed his conquest of Jerusalem, he stripped away the title of the King of the Jews from Hyrcanus II, but he did allow him to serve as ethnarch, something of a governing ruler, and he retained his position and serving as high priest. And Antipater was still pretty much the power behind the throne in all of that. Later, in 48 BC, when Pompeii was murdered, Julius Caesar began to reign, and Pompeii, having been supported by Hyrcanus and Antipater, now with Julius Caesar, Hyrcanus and Antipater must undoubtedly begin to think about their political futures and their political careers, and they must make careful decisions as they navigate these waters as to whom they would support as the stories begin to unfold. So, Hyrcanus and Antipater support Julius Caesar. Hyrcanus is confirmed in his office, and Antipater is actually given Roman citizenship for life. So you can see that he is beginning to figure out and beginning to make some political maneuvering that will allow him to find his way right into the heart of these stories. In 44 BC, as you know, Ides of March, Julius Caesar is stabbed to death. So that puts Hyrcanus and Antipater in a position again where they must be very selective, very careful about whom they will give their allegiance to, and they give their allegiance to the murderers of Julius Caesar. And then a couple years later, Octavian and Antony assume rule. So here again, Hyrcanus and Antipater are in a position where they must choose where to put their support, and in a very quick, fast political move, they put their support to Octavian and Antony. Between Octavian and Antony, the empire was divided as far as ruling the empire, and Octavian ruled the western portion of the empire from Rome, and Antony ruled the eastern part of the empire from Alexandria. Antipater was later assassinated, and ultimately Octavian and Antony came to disagreements, and the whole story began to turn inward on them. Once again, Herod, who is left now, must think very shrewdly about where his allegiances and where his loyalties are going to lie. So between the choices that he has, Octavian in the west, Antony in the east, it seems to Herod that Antony has the clear advantage here. Antony has, along the way as well, married the beautiful Cleopatra. And in Herod's mind, Antony is going to be the one who will be the successful reigner of the entire empire. So he has put his support behind Antony. Well, as history often has it, the turns and twists through it all just don't come out the way that we think they would, or how we kind of map things out, and this happened to Herod. Octavian was able to defeat Antony, and so Herod had to yet again figure out how he was going to manage his political future. And under the circumstances, he seems to have come up with a very brilliant plan. He had already been named in 40 BC as the king of the Jews by order of Octavian and Antony. And in 31 BC, when Octavian defeated Antony, and Octavian then became Augustus Caesar, Herod made his way to Octavian, to Augustus Caesar, in a move that was certainly calculated and yet very dramatic. Herod takes the crown off of his head and he lays it at the feet of Augustus Caesar. Augustus is very much impressed by this dramatic moment, and he takes the crown that has been laid at his feet and he places it back on the head of Herod and instructs Herod to go back to Jerusalem, and he reaffirms that Herod is king of the Jews. So Herod goes back to Jerusalem, and all along, even when Octavian and Antony had declared originally that he was the king of the Jews, Herod was in great disfavor and tremendous distrust among the Jews. He was seen as a half-blooded Jew. Stories of his aggression, stories of his willingness to destroy and kill anybody in his way that he felt like was a threat, anybody that was suspicious to him as a person who might undermine his rule or who might usurp his rule. King Herod had them put to death. Of the 10 wives that he had, one of his wives, Mary Ann, fell under suspicion, and King Herod even had her put to death. Of the sons that Herod had, 2 of his sons he had put to death in suspicion that they would assume the throne. Herod knew that he had to find ways to appease the Jews. He was certainly well aware of the disfavor that he had among them. So in seeking ways to do that, he tried to bring financial relief to the Jews, but he also engaged in tremendous building projects. He built cities. He had projects around the map going on, and the one that undoubtedly was the greatest attempt that he made to gain the favor of the Jews was the expansion and continued reconstruction of the temple itself. The temple that was in Jerusalem, as you remember, is nothing at all of the majesty and the grandeur that Solomon's temple had been before it was destroyed by the Babylonians. And so Herod had the brilliant idea that he could make efforts to restore all that the Jews had remembered, heard, and read about Solomon's temple. So in 28 BC, Herod began a project of building the temple. By the way, a project that continued for many, many years and was not fully complete until 63 AD, long after Herod had gone. So Herod, in fact, sought to appease the Jews. However, for the greater part, his attempt to appease the Jews was largely unsuccessful. He was still an object of hate because of his harsh regime. the terror that he expressed to anyone who threatened to oppose him. And in 4 BC, Herod died. Before his death, he managed to divide the kingdom among his 3 sons, Archelaus, Herod Antipas, and Philip. But it was also before his death, naturally, that Herod had heard reports of a potential rival king. And in response to those reports, it was this very Herod, this so-called Herod the Great, who ordered that the baby boys in Bethlehem, 2 years and younger, be slaughtered. So Herod has now gone to his own grave. And before he does so, he has certainly been the one who is responsible for the graves of many others. And he is the one who is part of the Christmas story, and the one that we encounter as the very Herod who ordered the slaughtering of the Bethlehem boys. So I hope that you will find this part of the story very meaningful, although up until we get to the time of Herod, these are not the stories, very much like the Alexander the Great stories of last session. We don't read these stories in the Bible. These are stories which, inasmuch as we have sought to just give the high part of the story, the mountaintop peaks of these stories, these are stories in which we see the continuance of the evil of humanity, in which we see the providence of God, we see the hand of God. We see that even in all of these things, God is continuing and carrying out his mission. So as you reflect and as you have conversation about these stories, I hope that you will have just wonderful conversations about people like Pompeii who violate holy places, and perhaps even in our own experiences, the ways that we see maybe in our own culture, things of God being violated, and how we, as followers of Jesus, respond to that. Or maybe you'll be able to take Antipater and see him as a political opportunist, and see how God's redemptive mission works even through a number of these individuals that we have talked about. And perhaps you would just have a wonderful time talking about these days, for the Apostle Paul talks about the fullness of time in which God sent his Son. And what way conceivable with people like Herod and the story that got him there, with Roman rule, in what ways possible would you think that this was indeed the fullness of time? So I hope you have a great time with these stories, and we will look forward to seeing and visiting with you in session 12.